Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Needs Some Introduction. In today's episode, I'm your host. Let me introduce myself. I'm your host, Victor. I never introduce myself on these podcasts. I
Speaking
really
of needing
should.
an introduction.
Indeed, needs some introduction to me. I'm the host of this podcast, sometimes by myself, but usually with a co-host. Sona here today with me.
Hi,
My most frequent co-host, been here from the very beginning.
that's right. We go way back.
We go way back further than the podcast itself, of course.
Older than time, really.
Oh, it feels like it. It really does feel like that. As far as my daughter is concerned, like it might as well be from another millennia. It is from another millennia in a way, right?
Yeah.
We here break down, watch, and discuss TV shows, usually TV shows. I mean, sometimes movies as well. We're here today to discuss the 8th episode of the Apple TV Plus series Severance. This episode is called Sweet Vitriol, directed by Ben Stiller, as about half of these episodes have been this season. Of course, a guiding hand here on the show, even when he's not directing. Before we get into the episode breakdown, Sona, and I can't wait to get your opinion of this episode, which really feels a bit like a little bit of a breather. Before then, some housekeeping. First of all, Sona, we have 90 subscribers on
Oh
YouTube.
my gosh, is it going to happen?
It's going to happen probably within the next week or so.
I hope it happens.
For those who are not aware, we had a challenge, or I had challenged the audience to try to get to 100 subscribers on YouTube. We had almost no subscribers there, and we have no video specific content, so it's not too surprising that we don't have many subscribers there. And we were trying to get to 100. This is just a very easy way, if you haven't subscribed already, to support the podcast. Any kind of traffic on YouTube just makes our videos and podcasts ranked higher in the recommendation engine. And of course, just a way to spread the word by just simply subscribing. You don't need to listen to the podcast there, although you can. Apple Podcasts, for example, very difficult to find episodes in our catalog, our back catalog. Very easy to do so in the YouTube interface. So that's just one reason you may want to choose to listen to us there. But much more importantly, if we get to 100, I've been saying we would have a video episode. We definitely will. I am pre-recording probably this week an introductory video with some recommendations that I would have ready to go as soon as we hit 100. That'll be a solo video. And honestly, it's just for me to get a little experience using the YouTube studio for editing because I've never done it before. So that will be available immediately when we hit to 100. But of course, the goal would be for Sona and I to actually have a conversation on camera. And that'll be a little more logistically complicated. So I'm just trying to wet my toes with a solo video. Help us reach that goal if we get to 100 soon, hopefully within the next week or two. We will publish those episodes. If they get a lot of viewership, maybe we will continue to publish YouTube content, depending on how much editing I can do between these episodes as well. We probably need to make them a little more of a special occasion, but it would be fun to maybe do it for the finale of Severance.
That would be fun.
Which, of course, is just 2 weeks away after this particular episode.
Oh my gosh.
So
Seriously?
close. Yep, it's coming up on us, Sona. So it could be perfect synergy. We may hit the 100 subscribers and get the finale on the same week. And speaking of finales, we just had the finale of the show Paradise, which just wrapped up a couple of days ago. And of course, my co-host on those episodes, Darren from Australia. And we will have a conversation in this upcoming week now that Paradise is finished. We'll be discussing Bong Joon-ho's career and Mickey 17, which is coming out. My personal opinion, by the way, Bong Joon-ho has made these psychological thrillers and these science fiction movies, usually metaphors for capitalism or the limitations of capitalism. I prefer his psychological dramas. Of course, his most recent film was Parasite, which won Best Picture and is the biggest, highest grossing Korean film of all times, made over $400 million around the world, a huge blockbuster. This is a much bigger budget production, English language science fiction film. A lot of his films are available on Netflix, by the way. Okja, which he made for Netflix, and Snowpiercer, which I'm not a huge fan of, by the way. My preference, his psychological thrillers, not only Parasite, but Mother, Memories of Murder. Sona, have you ever seen Mother by chance? Not the Mother exclamation point, lowercase, the other one. This is a South Korean drama. Have you ever seen this one by?
No, I haven't seen it.
I think you would very much enjoy this film. Is a real knockout, as is Memories of Murder, by the way, which is loosely based on the true story of the first known South Korean serial killer at the time of that movie being released about 20 years ago, the murders had not been solved, and since then have been solved. So it's an interesting historical document as well, but an incredible film as well. So I'll be recapping his career there. Just a preview of that conversation. We will also be covering yet another Apple TV Plus show, which begins next week, which is called Dope Thief. Have you heard about this one, Sona?
I haven't.
So this is Wagner Moura, who we've just seen in Civil War, and he was the other John in Mr. and Mrs. Smith, by the way.
Oh, okay. Right.
The partner of Parker Posey's character in that show. So he's the star of this one, and it's set in Philadelphia, outside Philadelphia, along with Brian Tyree Henry. They are best friends since they were kids and kind of losers. And what they've decided to do is impersonate DEA agents to infiltrate a crack house in their neighborhood to steal some of the drugs there and try to pull off this low-key drug heist. This is based on a book, as so many Apple TV shows are. This comes from Ridley Scott, who actually directs the pilot as well. But Sona, as you would expect, turns out that they have infiltrated the wrong drug den, and it is the center of a huge drug operation, and they are being pursued by the cops, by the criminals, in way over their heads. So we will be covering this show for the next month or so. And Sona, I bring this up because you and I will be talking about Your Friends and Family once Severance wraps up a couple of weeks after that, and we'll be continuing to cover The White Lotus, which I forgot to mention as well. A show that I'm very much looking forward to, but the next show that we'll be doing together, Sona, I believe, starting in May, is going to be a show called Task, which stars Mark Ruffalo, from the producers of Mayor of Easttown, set outside of Philadelphia, loosely based on a true story of a task force that is formed because apparently there is someone who's a non-criminal who is infiltrating drug dens and getting in over their heads. So it's almost like the opposite perspective of the same show.
Right. That's so funny.
Dope Thief will be wrapping up within a few weeks of the beginning of that show. So coincidence or intention, I don't know, but it might be interesting to see these two shows that are almost partners to each other playing.
What genre are each of these shows? Because I could see them being dramas, or I could see them being comedies, or maybe they're dramedies.
The trailer for Dope Thief has just been showing now in front of some of these Apple TV shows, and it's very intense, the trailer.
Okay.
But the camaraderie between the two of them seems jokey. So I do think it is hard-boiled, but probably with dark comedy to it, is my assumption.
I love that.
The little snippets, very few snippets, that the Mark Ruffalo show has been, that HBO has been previewing, that seems to be a straight up drama, and very much feels like in the universe of Mayor of Easttown, which of course we've covered here on the show. And from the same writing team, the same production team, shot in a lot of the same general locations. So I think it has that grittiness to it. So all things to look forward to coming in the podcast. Just some of the things we'll be covering here in the show. Plus, of course, summer movies and whatever else comes along the way. I'm sure we'll always be surprised by some show that gets announced the week before it's released. And I'm like, oh, I guess we'll cover that too. Paradise, for example, was a complete surprise and turned into a big hit for us. And lastly, stay tuned for the end of this episode. I have a feeling, and I could be completely wrong about this, that our conversation might be relatively short on this episode, which is very light on plot and a lot on character, of course.
I totally agree.
So it could be quick. And I have been teasing for multiple weeks now. I read the Ricken book, and I wanted to give my thoughts on it, not only review the book, but also clues for the rest of the show Severance. So do stay tuned. After my conversation with Sona, I will be appending that analysis. I was planning to include this weeks ago, but when our conversations went an hour and a half long, I'm like, well, I'm not going to do it here.
There's only so much we can ask of any one person's attention span.
So do stay tuned for that as well. Check the show notes if you want to skip around through some of those topics. All right, Sona. So before we get into it, Sweet Vitriol, what did you think of this episode? What do you think of this title? There's a lot of vitriol here. I don't know if there's any sweetness to it.
Okay, I'm so conflicted about this episode. I think it was beautifully shot.
Yes.
I think there was a lot of character development. I think it really conveyed a sense of place and time and feeling, all of that. Yet, I did not like this episode. I mean, the quality of it is there. My interest in this character was not enough to carry me through this deep dive into her past. I love the payoffs. I like the plot development. And I love Patricia Arquette.
Yeah.
But to me, this felt slow. And I am interested in her character, but I don't think I'm this interested in her character. I mean, I watched her brush her teeth for what seemed like a super long time.
Yeah.
I'm happy for the way in which it moved the plot forward, which I think was an important development, a meaningful development, a development that makes a lot of what we've seen before make sense. It was a shorter episode.
Yes.
I still think it
Yeah.
could have been half as long.
Yes.
What were your thoughts?
I agree with all that. I actually did like the episode for the aesthetics of it, and the construction of this episode and what it serves in the show works really well. And at the same time, I feel like this could have been a vignette in another episode, and
Yeah.
that would have been fine. Proof of what you're saying. I was watching the episode. My wife was tucking in my daughter. We usually watch this together. She showed up in the middle of the episode. And
And
she
you were
said,
like, you're fine.
yes. And she said, oh, can you rewind it so we can watch from the beginning? And I just paused it and said, this, and this happened. And then we watched it. And then we watched the featurette at the end. And I'm like, this featurette, this 2 minutes at the end is going to give you everything you need from the beginning. But then she did want to watch it with me. So I rewounded it to the very beginning. We watched, and we honestly, I fast forwarded through chunks of it because I'm like, she's brushing her teeth now. She's, in the
very
coffee.
good oral hygiene.
She's in the coffee shop, and then he drives out to the factory and just fast forwarded 3 minutes while she drives out, and then he pursues her there, and then they stare at each other for a couple minutes before they start talking again. This is a 44-minute episode. You can see the timestamps on it. That includes the credits and the featurette and the previously on. So this is 30-something minutes. And I told my wife, I'm like, I think there's maybe 20 minutes in which people are talking. The entire 35 minutes of actual show.
It's not like Severance is a happy show. I get that.
Right.
But this episode was it's so well conveyed a brutally depressing feeling that it was rough for me, right? Like it was just a giant downer.
What I liked about it and what I appreciated about it, let's say not liked about it, but what I appreciated about it, first of all, I think that the last two episodes are going to be truly packed with information. You think about how much information we had in the last episode, most of it just conveyed visually. So I liked having a little bit of a breather. The second thing, we have seen a lot of quirkiness in the way everybody talks to each other. This show has very much undone a lot of the mythology of Lumen, or I should say of the Severance show itself, where you think about Miss Casey giving these wellness speeches about your outie and how that was so funny. Once we have her context, how this is some kind of hell that she's living in. So it's kind of undone some of the too cute elements of what we saw in the first season of Severance. And I think this happens again here, where you have these characters and they speak in this very weird, stilted way. There's all this quirkiness and this strangeness in the behaviors of the Lumen employees in the context of this town, which is still under full sway of Lumen, and possibly even these people we see, these outsiders, may actually have been formerly from Lumen. Like I have questions about Ricken and his friends, of course, and I'll have some analysis of that once we get to that bonus content here at the end that I mentioned. But what I liked about this particular episode is seeing, like you mentioned, the outside world where everybody looks at Lumen as these people who destroyed this town. And there is none of the affectations. Like we see specifically when Patricia Arquette's character, when Cobel is talking to the James LaGrosse character, the coffee shop owner, he also worked at Lumen, but he has none of those affectations. He has none of the way that they speak. And even you see now the Sissy character, who still is very much in thrall of that way of life. And she looks like a weirdo in the middle of nowhere, right? So it's interesting to see the Lumen philosophy in the wild and how people are just kind of like, what are those weird cult members, basically? The show has no affectations at all. So I like the fact that we got to see the outside world. But I agree, in general, watching this was slow and It should have been half of an episode where maybe we were spending time with Mark and with his sister and his recovery.
The
So
reintegration, yeah.
yeah, so maybe there could have been 10 minutes of that and then intercut with Cobel's experiences. Something like that, I think structurally would have made the show more compelling. Although, given all that, this is maybe my least favorite episode of this entire show up until this point.
Agree.
We still have a lot of really interesting outcomes here and huge revelations.
I agree with you, but you're using a plural. I feel like it's a singular.
Yeah, well, one huge, one huge revelation. But then I do think that Cobel's backstory, which is conveyed once again.
Yes, I'm wrapping that all together. But yes,
okay. As all agreed. Okay, you're saying that as one revelation. I'm seeing the huge revelation, but then of course the lesser revelations. This context for Cobel, which I do think is very interesting. I think it does make her character more. So I appreciate what the show is doing. I appreciate how it enriches Cobel's character. I like the big twist. And yet the episode itself, I mean, if I ever watch this episode again, I will fast forward through at least 25 minutes of it.
Right. I mean, she was just in that house forever.
Of a long time. Yes. I mean, she's like sleeping in the bed. We see the time passing and the light changing through the window, which is a beautiful shot, by the way, an incredible shot of her laying there for hours, apparently, as the light changes outside. Really wonderfully photographed across the board. But that's another 3 or 4 minutes of the episode that could be trimmed out.
Agree.
So let's dig into it a little bit. She arrives at this town, Salt's Neck. We had seen this sign. It looked like she was going the opposite direction from Salt's Neck, if I remember, when she made that U-turn. And it was like 200 and something miles away.
Maybe she's just been changing her mind back and forth this entire time.
Very well may have turned around. We actually saw her. She's at the sign saying Salt's Neck is 200 and something miles away. Yeah. She makes a U-turn. Then we have the episode where she meets in the parking lot with Helena. Yeah. And maybe then she decides she reverses course again. Right. But now she does indeed make the same trip out, but this time she goes all the way out to Salt's Neck. This completely desiccated. I thought this was like New England. My wife is from Vermont, and there are a lot of these mill towns near rivers and near lakes that are very much like this, abandoned fishing outposts, etc. And this very much feels like that. It turns out in the featurette at the end, this is actually much further away. This isn't like Maine. This is Newfoundland, which is kind of similar to Maine, actually, in its geography.
Is it maybe pronounced Newfoundland? It's not my...
it may be. It might,
not a big deal. Just wondering.
The location itself is called Fogo Island, which is really evocative, by the way. I love that shot as they come up over the hill and you see all those houses crammed onto that little slip of island. And then, of course, to be among the houses and you see how run down they are, how this is nearly an abandoned location. And maybe specifically this island may actually be abandoned. Not in the context of the show, but in reality, I should say.
It has that very, if you're familiar with upstate New York and around the lakes up there, it has that, and in the winter time, it has that very gray, dreary feeling soaked into it in this episode.
And some beautiful cinematography. As we mentioned just last week, the cinematographer nearly the cinematographer for the entirety of the series. She also directed last week's episode. She had picked out this location. She had worked out there on some film years ago and had suggested this as a possible location. Very beautiful, evocative. I love the desolation of the little white rabbit cruising along the coastline of that icy landscape headed to the island. So yeah, I loved the way this looked. I loved seeing the water crashing along the edges of the lake. And then we see her, she's arrived, she brushes her teeth for multiple minutes while she watches some unhoused person huffing ether, apparently. These are all ether addicts. We have heard in the Cure mythology that they made their money by producing ether, and apparently they had children working at these factories, which, by the way, not uncommon. We're talking about the history of this company over 100 years ago. My daughter recently was reading up for school on the Newsies strike. So we watched the Disney movie Newsies about these boys who used to sell newspapers. But now she's actually doing a in-class play, something that they do, which is about a children's labor strike from the late 1800s. So Late 1800s, children working in mills, not uncommon, unfortunately.
Hmm.
Although, of course, this is not the 1800s. This is, within Cobel's lifetime. So apparently,
Yes.
in this town, they were still allowing child labor even at that point. Oh, of course, Devin is calling throughout the course of this episode, but she does ignore Devin's calls until very late in the episode. She shows up at this coffee shop. James LaGrosse is there. He's running this coffee shop. The actor James LaGrosse. I don't know the character's name at all. He looks very Guy Pearce here, by the way. Guy Pearce and James LaGrosse are becoming the same person, I think. And Cobel has this conversation. They obviously have history with each other. She needs a favor. She needs him to drive her up to Sissy's house, but she won't even have this conversation in public. So she tells him to meet at the factory. He does drive out there and asks his coworker to close up shop. I like when he heads out there that he says, "Do you know how fucked it is that that you asked me to meet here?" Mm-hmm. Apparently, like, he has a lot of trauma from his years of child labor and probably ether addiction back
mm-hmm.
at apparently they were 8 years old when he became addicted to
Crazy.
ether. So an insane revelation there as well. On the radio, we hear "Where Do You Go From Here" by Charles Bradley. And I recommend everybody out there check out Charles Bradley, who passed away just a couple of years ago. Check out Charles Bradley's cover of the Black Sabbath song "Changes." It is incredible. It will change your life. Change your life.
Wow, that's quite an endorsement.
Quite an endorsement. So what did you think about these interactions between them? Obviously, they have history. Do you think this was romantic? She does make jokes that Keir met his wife at the ether factory.
At first, I thought he was her brother.
And
yes,
I thought it might be a family member. Yes.
Yeah, as I'm speculating as what's going on. But then by the end of the episode, I think they had some sort of romantic relationship as, maybe preteens or teenagers. I don't know that it was like a deep love affair, but I think there was some romantic connection between them. And even when she says we used to be chums, it feels like that's a little bit layered and it's more than just friendly.
How long do you think it's been since they've seen each other? She's talking about they were very young. She apparently was part of the same program, Wintertide, internship, that we see Miss Wong is part of now. That you presume would be someone who'd be a little older, late teenager, early, young adult. So maybe she worked there for that entire period of time. And
that's the sense I got.
And then he was working there as well. If he can recognize her, he obviously has seen her since she's been 8 years old.
I feel like maybe until she was college age, they knew each other. But I'm just
you were just
going on
here,
my
right?
gut. Yeah, there's no reason for me to think that.
The dynamic here is interesting where he does reluctantly drive her out to Sissy's house. Sissy turns out to be her aunt. Of course, we know she has this trauma about her mother's death, her mother's sister. And her nickname is Sissy, apparently even to the public, because we see a plaque at one point in the house where she's designated as Sissy on the plaque itself. When he arrives at the house, says, she's still living in the same place and she's a pariah in the town. So apparently everybody in town has turned against Lumen, who probably abandoned the town at some point and, left them all addicted to ether along the way. When they arrive at the house, he tells her, tell her that I said for her to drop dead. But what's interesting about it is when he says that she's a pariah, Cobel takes some offense to this. And it's interesting, that dynamic of always being defensive about family or friends, even if you have your own issues with them, because she's offended by that. But then when she goes into the house, Sissy says, I don't want that ether addict in this house, or Huffer, or whatever she calls him. And she blames Sissy, going like, you're the one who addicted him in the first place. So I just find that dynamic interesting, because I see it all the time where you have your own qualms with somebody, but then when you are talking about someone else, like they're not allowed to,
of course,
say anything derogatory about them. Like I could be judgmental, but you
absolutely.
Can. What did you think about her interactions here with Sissy, played by Jane Alexander, by the way, who's been around forever? I mean, she's been making movies since the 70s. She was in Kramer versus Kramer. She still does a lot of work now. She was in The Blacklist recently, the TV series, and in a bunch of episodes there. And Sona, she was the child psychologist in The Ring, the Naomi Watts version of The Ring. So she's been around forever and always acting, but very good here. And, have to be memorable in just one, probably the only episode we'll see her in.
She did an amazing job playing a very unlikable person.
Very unlikable, yes.
She hit all the notes to make us understand the type of person she is, the type of relationship she has with Cobel, with Harmony,
Mhm.
and the history between them.
Such an unlikable person, but such a specific person. Like, these people who
Mm-hmm.
have committed their lives to something and they have nothing, but they cling to it because it's literally what other options do they have at this point? They're not going to reject their decisions.
And just so, so unpleasant to be around, you know?
Just terrible. And of course, whatever interaction she has had with these former children that worked at this place, he won't even step into the house unless he has to, which of course eventually he does. So Harmony goes back to her room. She is so trapped in that childhood, by the way, even the way it seems like there's some toy she made, like some stuffed animal that just has like a face painted on it. It might have just been like something she made out of rags. And she like touches it. Probably this was like one of the few things that she had as a child that she had some emotional attachment to. So it's a very sad existence to imagine that she probably had so little that she could cling to.
Mm-hmm.
Her mom seemed to be a skeptic about Lumen, so it's strange that Harmony had such a neglected childhood. I guess what probably happened, now I'm just speculating, it looks like the Egan family had a lot of pull here. The mother was a skeptic. The daughter starts working in the ether factory. She gets picked as a exemplar of some kind. She gets caught up in working for the Egan family and for Lumen in general. She gets more and more successful within that world. She drifts further and further away. And if her mom was always a skeptic about the Egans and Lumen in general, she probably became completely alienated from her mother. And then, of course, her mother dies before she can even say goodbye.
We also don't know how long this illness went
Sure.
on.
Right.
So maybe part of it is that her mom was sick and
Right.
Sissy stepped in and made these decisions for Harmony.
But Harmony's room was there from an early age. So, yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah. So we don't know how long the mother was sick for, but she was living with the aunt in this house when Harmony was a child and probably for many years. And then she became sick, or good point you make that maybe she was sick for a very long time and under the care of her sister and living in her own version of hell, right? If she truly despised the Egans and has her sister be a loyalist and losing her daughter to the Egans as well, might explain some of her decisions there at the end.
It's not clear, so all speculation, but it's one
Sure.
way things might have played out.
There is a version of this show where someone sits down and says, when mom got sick 25 years ago, I mean, like it starts telling you. And then when I went to college, and then, but you didn't, why didn't you visit more often? Right. And it's like literally just all told to us. I do like the fact that we get enough information about the psychology of the character, which is the most important part. And we don't have to have those. Well, when the real estate market went underwater in 2009, with those,
The exposition, yeah.
yeah, exactly. Although there is a version of that where he jokes about how the town collapsed after the real estate market inverted. He
Yes.
goes like a very technical explanation as to what happened. Oh, we found out, by the way, along the way that Drummond has been in contact with Sissy. She unplugs the phone before she heads upstairs to do her investigation. She doesn't want her potentially calling Drummond. Although it turns out that Lumen somehow got the memo and sent somebody out there. We see them by the end of the episode. And yeah, we have the sequence of time she wants to get into her mother's room. Supposedly, you're not supposed to go into the room until she's reunited with Kier. There is some amount of time or some mythology, some religious element to this about the amount of time needed to not enter the dead person's room. During the conversation, a character point and then something that is probably part of this mythology. One is, of course, Cobel very much wants to know what were the last words that her mother spoke after she took the breathing tube out. You can imagine if she was on this breathing tube for an extended period of time, she was not able to speak, obviously. But I mean, I guess she could write possibly, but not actually speak. And she's had this hose with her, by the way, this whole entire time. So it's finally finally connecting that hose back, which has been like a journey she's been on this whole entire series. Probably wants to know if she said anything about Cobel herself, Harmony. Sissy says that if she had had faith, if she believed in this Lumen religion, that she could have sought solace in the nine. So there's some other element to what happens when you die. And of course, there's also some idea of resurrection as well. So these are all like little clues that are being dropped. But I think that this belief system of this reincarnation and these afterlife experiences are probably more foundational to this religion, even further back, even before the severance process.
There's also some kind of reference she makes to woe as well.
You bring woe into this house, and they do have a lot of talk about, around.
Yeah, those keywords. Yeah.
Right. They're framing their arguments with each other very much around the indoctrination they have with the cure philosophy, which I also find it interesting that when you see her talking to the James LeGros character earlier on, she's still talking and even dropping some of those words. And you see how he rejects it, though. But it's so ingrained in her that even as she is confronting Sissy, that she still can't break away from that indoctrination, right? She's still talking in those terms. Yeah, and then we have this protracted period. Like, I agree, this it's very moody and evocative, and there's a good character moment there when he finally breaks into the house.
Most patient friend ever, by the way.
Yeah, how long is he out there? Exactly. It's getting
Is the heat on in the truck? What is happening?
Yeah, is he going to just burn all that gas too? Like, he needs gas to get back, of course.
Maybe he was getting high the whole time.
He might have been huffing the entire
Help
time.
pass the time.
He has some there, so maybe he huffed too much, passed out, and wakes up 3 hours later. He's like, "Oh wow, crap! I gotta get it." So she finds the key. She gets into her mom's room. She plugs in the hose. She is trying to, I guess, commune with her mother. That experience she had of being on the ventilator. Falls asleep, presumably at some point. We see the son pass. He comes inside, and then they huff ether together. She says she hasn't huffed since she was 8 years old, which is insane.
Sick.
That she did it when she was 8 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And of course tells us that they started truly child labor. This wasn't like 15-year-olds working at the ether factory. They were really young when they were working there together. Yet another human rights violation here within the show of the Lumen. They just keep piling them up. And whatever she's looking for, she can't find it. She's like, there's no way she actually got rid of it. She claims she sold everything. She doesn't believe it. And then they go to this shelter outside. A very interesting design to this house. I mean, I'm sure they picked it because of this interesting design it has. The basement is separated from the house, and a very cool shot of her knowing where it is and then descending into this area where, of course, all of the old things actually are. And
I expected to find the mom there in some sick, twisted way.
It was like The Ring or something was about to happen.
Yeah.
They found a well in there. But instead, she's looking for, is it Keir or Jane Egan's bust? I'm not sure which one it is, but one of the Egan busts. Also takes with her a book that I think is going to pay off later on. It's Annual Reminiscences. So I do wonder if there's someone else in the show, maybe Irving, perhaps, that might also be in one of these books as well. Took that with her, and she did leaf through it momentarily. I'm sure that's going to be a clue to that's going to pop up again later. But of course, most importantly, she finds the bust. She opens it up, and there's a notebook inside. And dun dun dun, revelation that she was the designer of the severing process.
It makes sense about her investment in this, her attitude that she's had this entire time. She clearly is offended by people questioning her and having the nerve to try and keep her subservient in some way.
Right.
And now it makes so much sense. It's like when you are, as a middle-aged person, like when you're talking to someone younger than you that acts like they know everything, and you're kind of just like, listen, you have no idea what you're talking about. You haven't lived yet. I have the life experience to understand this, and you don't. It's like she's had that attitude this entire time. Why are you trying to tell me something that I already know?
Yeah, I think that it adds a lot of context to all of that, and all the confusion we saw as to how she sometimes seemed to be very sympathetic towards the severed and sometimes not. A lot of times that frustration might be the failures of her, of the technology itself, and then her feeling that, of course, because it's her technology that's supposed to work. For example, it's very important, I think, that in last week's episode, we saw something that happened in season 1 when Mark went back to the wellness room. They give him clay to work with. and he makes the tree that he thinks that his wife crashed into the night when she passed away. So something is bleeding through. The pain, the trauma of the experience is bleeding through. And of course, her frustration when she sees Miss Casey talking to him, and she says that the best experience of my life, because she's only been alive in her own mind for, at 1 or 2 hours at a time. So she's very young. The Miss Casey persona has very little life experience. But she said that being there with you and spending that time with you was so fulfilling. And then you see Cobel gets angry and says, send her back to the testing floor. And I was like, I don't understand that. Wasn't she just sympathizing with the Mark character an episode ago? And now she's so disparaging. Now I'm reading it a little differently, that once again, she's seeing the emotion seep through. So if she was trying to find some way to truly, and that seems to be what they're trying to do in the previous episode on the testing floor, of like literally giving someone PTSD and then testing or checking whether the negative emotion is bleeding through the severance. If that's what they've been testing this whole time, that's a disappointment for her own technology. And when you think about her being vested in it, not only as for some reason, like we were trying to wonder last year, does she want to get severed? Why does this tie into her mother somehow? If she's trying to truly sever an emotional response, then her technology is failing. And it's her technology, literally her invention.
She's kind of being positioned right now to perhaps be like a hero to Mark.
Yes.
But how twisted is it that she is living next door to this couple?
Oh, yes.
I assume for at least a little while before Gemma is in the accident. And so she's seeing them come and go and like have their life together. And now she has severed them from each other, literally and figuratively. And she's like conducting little experiments with them like they're dolls.
Oh, I mean, that's exactly what's so fascinating about the final moments here, and where the episode does a great job of setting all that up. She may very well be the person who Mark needs at this moment to be able to pull off his plan. And simultaneously, she is exactly what you described, a complete monster, being there every day, watching these severed people who are separated from each other. She knew them on the outside world, and she sees Mark's torment on the outside world right now. And presumably she knows what's happening with Gemma on the testing floor as well. So she knew Gemma trapped on the testing floor. She knew current Mark. She knew he thinks she's dead and that this is his torment. This is a personal torment that she feels, this unresolved pain with her mother that she is trying to replicate in Mark and then test it out on the severance floor. So it is incredible cruelty on her part. Or at least, if not cruelty, it's just an incredible coldness.
Like inhumanity.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. It is a complete lack of humanity. That's what I appreciated about the episode, in what it accomplishes in making you think about all these things and recontextualize, even though the experience of watching the episode, maybe not the best. Admirable, though, when they edited this together, they should have been like, well, maybe we need to shoot a couple of scenes that are happening somewhere else and, append them to the beginning of this episode. Or like anything that might have been cut out of an earlier episode, they might be like, well, maybe we just put that here. But maybe it's the opposite. Maybe they had that with the extra footage and they said, let's make this just a Cobel episode.
Maybe we originally saw her floss too, and they edited that out.
It could have been worse. It could have been 5 minutes of flossing. That's a good point.
Speaking of appending things, think about how in the previously on, they show Helena saying to Harmony, I think you overestimate your contributions.
Absolutely. Yes.
I mean, Helena obviously doesn't have a clue.
She can't know. Exactly.
Or she's gaslighting her like crazy, because who could say that to the person who invented this?
There's no way that Helena knows, right? First of all, Helena, outside of the context of Cobel, without any irony, she goes, well, my dad was the one who invented that technology, really. And her dad, when they were in the bathroom together, when she was Hale in the outside world, and he said, I remember when I showed you the severance device for the first time and you were just a little girl and you said, oh, can everybody get one of these? And like now, because of you, everyone will be able to, right? Like this is when she supposedly is going to make that whole speech that sells
Yeah.
Severance to the wider world in the finale of season 1. I'm pretty sure that she believes the mythology of her dad. So I do wonder, Helena probably has more complexity to her, the Audi version of her. And I do wonder what this revelation is going to do. And by the way, it makes me read that final moment between the two of them. She definitely felt threatened, of course. But I think that was the motivator for her to go like, no. I'm going to go, and I'm not just going to tell her, hey, I invented this. She's going to be like, right, sure, you did, Harmony. But she'll be like, I have proof, and I'm going to go get it.
Given what else happens in this episode, she better make some photocopies real fast.
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, she finds this notebook, evidence that she created this technology. Didn't know that she had this scientific skill at this point, to be honest. I guess we've only seen her as this manager character, which of course is very interesting to suddenly recontextualize her that way as well, that she has also been a scientist conducting an experiment. Once again, can explain some of the confusion in her emotional reaction to some of these things earlier.
Yeah, she's not just a middle manager.
Exactly. Absolutely not. And when you're like, that's so weird, the version of her outside and inside, which of course, even though she is one person, the manager character she plays is a performance, right? So it is part of this metaphor that this show has always been about the versions that we portray to each other in different contexts, especially at work, but also in private life as well. So the scene I want to talk about is the one you already hinted at, which is maybe the best scene in the whole entire show, because so many things happen there. She comes back inside. She has the notebook. She says that the Egans destroyed this town. Sissy says they made this town. It is an interesting duality that I've heard, by the way, in these exact type of abandoned mill towns, where some people felt like, or mining towns, for example, or fishing towns, when this corporate fishery of some kind moves to another town or moves overseas, the places dry up. For example, the town where my wife's father used to live, they were at the time the biggest furniture manufacturing town in all of America, and therefore in the world. And this is like in the 1950s. And now all of that, they still distribute furniture from that locale, but this is all imported from overseas. So even though they still have a big import-export business there, the actual jobs of assembling furniture have disappeared. Well, did this company destroy the town, or did it build the town, or did it do both things? It just depends on where you are on that historical cycle. But much more importantly in this scene is a few revelations. One is that as ugly as the relationship between Sissy and her, she's never told her that is her mother who pulled her own tube out. She has let Harmony believe she euthanized her. What did you think about that?
I don't know what to think about that. It seems like maybe it was a kindness to not let Harmony believe that her mother was in so much pain and so miserable that she chose to end her own life. This character does not seem the type to be capable of that type of kindness, but maybe it's showing how complicated people are.
It's funny, when I saw it, I read it as a form of kindness in saving her this information. But then now that I'm saying it out loud, and I do agree that the character doesn't seem to have that extra shading of empathy, maybe she just doesn't want people to know that the sister killed herself, or that she was so miserable being cared for by her. Maybe she thought that that was a better story, an alternate story.
Certain things that are just absolute no-goes. Maybe ending your own life is one of those things in this mythology, and so she doesn't want people to know that's what happened.
Well, Catholicism is also, definitely a no-go. No matter how bad life is, you're never. That's a huge taboo. There are multiple religions that have that opinion, so maybe that's the case.
Protect the family reputation, maybe. Although, I mean, it seems like the mom already did some damage to it.
The reason I can't get the read, even though I did kind of read it that way in the moment, that it was some kind of kindness to her, is because what happens immediately afterwards, where she shows her the notebook And you see her taking this in. She knows it's Harmony's handwriting. She is 100% convinced you invented Severance. And then she immediately tries to throw it into the fireplace. I'm like, what is this, a furnace, I guess? What would you call it?
I'm the wrong person to ask about that. I just saw a fire and I saw paper and I knew something bad was going to happen.
Oh, I knew she was going to try to throw it in there. I thought she was actually going to throw it in there, so at least she did rescue it.
Yes.
She does react immediately. She was ready for that.
She was ready. Yes.
She's like, she's going to try to throw this in the fire. And I'm going to make a move as soon as she starts moving in that direction. She is much older than I am.
Yes.
Yeah. And I just thought that was so shocking in a way that she will give her no empathy at all, even appreciating the fact that they stole her work and preserving the Lumen mythology when she is just some person, honestly, out there waiting for death. I would assume nobody in that town cares about her other than she is this pariah that lives on the edge of town. And yet she's still so committed to preserving the Egan family reputation. It's shocking, actually. It's kind of shocking.
That's a cult for you.
Good point. Good point. And then Cobel leaves. The coffee shop owner, this guy, the James LeGros character, stays behind, says, take my keys and get back and do what you need to do. I'm going to stay here and delay them as best I can, which is actually pretty noble of him, to be honest. She gets in the car. She talks to Devin. Devin says he's been reintegrated. He's not dead. She says he's not dead yet. No, she's not dead yet. He actually seems to be fine. She knows, of course, right away. She says, right. She knows right away who's responsible. Ragabi, she says under her breath or out loud. And then Mark gets on there and starts talking to her. And she says, tell me everything. Interestingly, though, Devin says, we have a plan. So I guess we will know that plan next week. I cannot wait to hear it. Before we get into some of the tangents I want to dig into a little bit, just Firewoman by the Cult, by the way. The Firewoman is playing on the radio. That album came out in 1989. I had it, by the way, on cassette.
Nice.
Firewoman. I love that song. But earlier, she's listening to the Stone Roses. That album came out in 1989. This Volkswagen Rabbit is not the 1989 version. I literally looked up the 1989 version of the Volkswagen Rabbit, which is hideous, by the way. It has round lights. This apparently is, someone's already done the research. This is a 1984 Rabbit. So do you think this is Harmony's car from like when she went to Lumen to start her internship as like a young adult, and she still had the same car 40 years later?
They don't make cars like they used to, huh?
It's true, but my dad still drives a car that's almost as old.
I hadn't given it all that much thought, but I wouldn't rule it out. I think it's quite possible.
Yeah, just wondering about the age of the car, and then the music all being from the same year as well. That's the on a road trip. That's the music she put in there, and she's never upgraded her music, and she's never upgraded her car apparently either.
Well, where is she going to find cassettes to buy now?
That's true, right? You got to play the cassettes you got. What else are you going to do? There's only one other thing that we haven't touched on that I wanted to kind of talk about in this recontextualization of her relationship with the severance process, etc. I had speculated on my theory episode of Severance that Cobel was really vested in Severance and wanted to continue to be the manager there because of this pain she feels for the death of the mom. And I thought, well, is this some way she thinks she can like resurrect the mom? But presumably the mom was never severed. We'd have to assume this was a long time ago, even if Severance is older than we know. And apparently we're almost certain to discover that it is older technology than before it became mainstream, given the conversation that Irv had in a previous episode with Bert. But even given all that, I had assumed that maybe this was some way to reconnect with the mom. Now I'm starting to think it's a way where she wants to be able to use this technology to somehow remove this memory, this pain she still carries from her mom's death. Does that make sense to you, or do you have an alternate theory?
I think that might be part of why she's so invested in it. But at the same time, I don't think this character has any intention of actually doing this to herself.
It's not about the severing part of it. I'm more curious about the macro data refinement part of it, where they are able to remove these imperfections. By the way, in this bonus content, I'm going to talk about not only the Ricken character, I'm also going to talk about the Lexington letter ebook that was published with the first season. In that book, which is also available, by the way, for anybody, they have attached the manual, the refinement manual with the little character that represents the implant. It describes what macro data refining is. It says a refiner is someone who makes something pure, more usable, and more accessible, whether it is an oil industry, the sugar industry, or our industry. As a lumen refiner, you'll be removing impurities from data and reorganizing that data into its purest form. So basically, the idea of refining something into its purest form. And I think that since we have seen they are refining these actual individuals, that maybe it's not about her being severed, it's about her being able to cherry pick these painful memories, the woe, right? Literally, shout it out here, remove that from her. I think that when she sees that the loss, the pain, even in the severed people, comes back, that she knows that her technology will fail at some point.
Maybe she's waiting until the process is perfected.
Yeah, I assume that.
Where in the timeline did her mother pass away? Do we know that? Is it clear?
I don't know if they tell us exactly how long it's been. She was probably working for Lumen early on, so she's probably
But not living at home anymore. Right? Yeah.
Right. It looks like she hadn't lived at home since she was very young. I assume she's probably estranged from her mother. I'm actually searching how long ago did.
Are you asking AI?
I'm just asking Google, but it will probably ask AI. In Severance, Cobel's mother, Charlotte, died while Cobel was away at school, and Cobel blames her Aunt Sissy for her mother's death. So while she was at school, I mean, we see it in season 1 where she has the Egan School for Girls diploma. Maybe that's when she was actually in that school. So maybe not even an adult yet, but maybe pre-college age even. And she still bears this pain. This is a very long time for her to be carrying this around. Maybe that's represented by the old car and everything that she's in this arrested development from that period of time. One more thing I want to bring up. Earlier in season 1, she mentions that her mother was very devout and a Christian, and then she'll say her mother was an atheist. So every time she brings up her mom, she'll have 2 very different versions of the mom, which I thought was an interesting duality all the way back in season 1. And now I'm thinking, is these 2 mothers she's talking about, is it her mother, Charlotte, and Sissy, right? Because those are 2 very different women.
I don't think she would ever refer to Sissy as her mom.
It's a good point. Anyway, just something I thought about because Sissy's obviously very different from her mother, and they were sisters. So
yeah.
All right. Anything else you wanted to mention?
No, I mean, as I said, I had mixed feelings about this episode. I felt it was generally a huge downer, but I am looking forward to the last 2 episodes of the season.
Yeah, I think it's a very exciting setup for the next episode. I find it very funny that this very, very, very dour episode opens with the sound of water crashing on rocks, ends on Firewoman, like it's like a fist pumping rock anthem. Maybe that's the tone for the next episode, because not the tone for this episode at all. We will know. We only have 2 more episodes, and very, very excited to see the confrontation, which could be very ugly between Cobel, Devin, and Mark, but they have to work with her, especially with Gabi just up and leaving. And so 2 more episodes, Sona, just 2 more episodes.
I can't believe there's only 2 left. It seems crazy, doesn't it?
And this is 10 episops this season, right? So this is 8, 9, 10, 2 more.
It flew by.
I thought you said it's Lubai, and I'm like, who? I'm like, oh, flew by. What are we talking
about? The key to everything. No, I feel like it went very fast this season. As we've said repeatedly, the season has not dragged at all.
At all. No.
Except for this episode.
Except for this episode, exactly. All right, Sona, thank you again. And by the way, just a reminder that stay tuned for that bonus content if you're curious to find out about those 2 free Apple ebooks have been provided. Anybody has an Apple device, you get it for free. Just go into your books and download them. The UUR is available as an audiobook. I do recommend the audiobook version of it because the actor himself reads it, and it is hilarious. So do enjoy that. And and my thoughts on it, not only a review of it, but how it ties into some of the mysteries in the show. And that is coming right after I wrap up this conversation with Sona. Sona, thank you again.
Thank you.
And we will meet again very soon because we'll be talking about The White Lotus,
That's
episode
right.
4. Another very slow episode of that show last week, but I have a feeling we're going to have some bigger happenings this week on that show.
Definitely felt like it from the previews.
For sure. Lots of revelations. So stay tuned for all of that. Thanks again.
Talk to you later.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
I'll be right back after a short break. Okay, so for those not in the know, a few weeks back now, Apple released an audiobook and an ebook called The UUR, at least the first 8 chapters, supposedly, of the very book that we saw in the Severance series itself, written by Dr. Ricken Laszlo Hale. And the ebook version of the book is actually performed by Michael Chernis, the actual actor who plays the Ricken character in the series. Very entertaining, as you would expect, him reading his own novel. Before I get into the breakdown of that book, and these books, by the way, and that I'm going to reference here, are both available to anybody that has an Apple device. So I'm not promoting Apple. I don't get paid by them or anything. And by the way, this is all free. You don't have to pay for any of this. It's free ebooks, free audiobook in the case of the UUR. But when season 1 of Severance came out, there was a book that came out from Anonymous, which was actually called The Lexington Letter. So we actually need to start with that Lexington letter before we get into the UUR to talk about some interesting clues that might be being dropped here over the course of these 2 supplemental materials. So the Lexington letter supposedly is a number of emails, mostly from one writer, going to a newspaper from a person called Peggy Kincaid. And over the course of the letter, we discover that Peggy had a twin sister, I believe. Interesting with twins and sisters and these dynamics that keep repeating throughout this series. And when they were younger, they had created a language to communicate with each other that only they knew, using symbols rather than letters. And over the course of the letter, we discover that Peggy had been a macro data refiner and had undergone the severance procedure, of course. One day she comes home and she finds a piece of paper in her pocket written by her innie. Apparently the innie had started to have these symbols in her mind, so somehow the memory of this created language was in her head, and for whatever reason, she was curious to know if her outie could interpret it. So she had written a note saying hello to her outie self. And this is actually very sweet. As they communicate back and forth, her outie self will paint her nails a bright color to surprise her innie self. And they have this very sweet back and forth, a very sisterly dynamic, replacing apparently this estranged dynamic with her actual sister. One day, innocuously enough, the innie writes a note saying that they had been given extra rewards because there was so much celebration around the fact that they had completed a particular file. There's even a detail in the communication from the innie that the file had been cleansed at 2:30 in the afternoon. That night, Peggy, the outie, of course, at home, on the news she hears that one of Lumen's competitors, Dour Therapeutics, had had some kind of attack. A bomb had gone off, I believe, in one of the trucks, and it had killed the driver and had killed some bystanders as well. And it was a large enough deal that it was national news. Peggy, for whatever reason, hearing Lumen associated as a competitor to this company and seeing the coincidence of the time, the attack occurred within minutes of the file being cleansed, immediately gets suspicious. She sends a note warning her innie that something suspicious may have occurred. And after this point, she does not hear back from her innie. Some strange things start happening. She's wet one day when she gets home. And eventually, after an extended period of time, she hears back from her innie. Apparently, the communication had been intercepted. She'd been placed in the break room for an extended period of time. She doesn't know how long. She says, "I think you're right about Lexington." The letter was referring to the file, Lexington. All these files that we've seen in the show that are being cleansed by our macro data refiners have the name of a location. And along with this note is also that the code detectors had been down that day, perhaps to be modified to prevent any kind of symbols from being passed inside or out based on this particular interaction. But as they were down, they were able to smuggle out one of the actual booklets that we see in the show, and I quoted it specifically in this conversation with Sona. If you'd like to read the entire thing, it's pretty insightful. I think the most intriguing elements is this idea of how do you purify your file? And if that file now we can see represents a particular person, what does that mean for the overall goals of the company, whether that is to create a more perfect person, a more perfect employee, or maybe even something more nefarious than that. One day she returns to work. She immediately gets kicked back off the elevator. She finds a note balled up in her mouth, warning her that she's being observed. Don't trust the company. And this is what leads her to write this letter to the newspaper. Now, all of these correspondences are actually being passed by a reporter to her editor. The editor just appears as Jim M throughout most of these interactions. And when we get to the end, she asks her editor, should I pursue this story any further? And he goes, actually, we just got word that Peggy Kincaid had died in a car accident, complications related to a car accident. Sounds familiar. And it turns out that this editor, Jim, has the last name of Milchick, Jim Milchick, who also happens to mention in another part of this correspondence that he knows somebody who actually works within Lumen, and the story is really not worth pursuing. So that is the first mention of this terroristic attack, this truck explosion in New York, which leads us to the UUR. Beyond Easter eggs and conspiracy theories, the main reason to check out the UUR is because it's very funny. Just to be clear, as you would expect, this fictionalized version of Ricken's book would be. But let's get into some of the connections between this to other Severance mythology elements and just some interesting observations about some of Ricken's philosophy. Okay, first things first, Ricken mentions that he had left the city because his wife had been very disturbed by the terroristic truck attack in New York. So this very truck explosion is the trigger for them to move to this area. Unclear, but possible that Devon actually worked for Dorner. It is a possibility. One of Lumen's competitors, which may also explain the natural animosity she has towards, or suspicion at least, towards Lumen. Later, they go for a hike with a close family member and his wife. Let's call them Flip and Nan. These are the names he gives to these characters. Flip maybe represents the switch that's been inserted into Mark's head. And Nan, I'm not sure how that correlates to Gemma, but it certainly is Gemma. In this particular story, Flip and Devon go for a nap. They get tired pretty quickly on the hike, while Nan, quote unquote, and Ricken read passages from Dr. Zhivago back and forth to each other. Ricken at one point is highly disturbed seeing a wig in a tree, which turns out to be a beehive that he doesn't recognize as a beehive. So just odd that certain things that should be relatively commonplace, I guess maybe if you grew up in the city all the time, you wouldn't have seen it. But still, he acts pretty oddly to these things and even gets mocked for not having recognized that it was a beehive. And Flip, soon thereafter, within months, is severely traumatized by the death of his wife, Nan. Ricken decides to write a poem for the funeral, and the poem is silly as you would expect. Like a bee with a broken antenna, I am now in a sad man's dilemma, for draining my soul is a dark weeping hole in the shape of my dear, sweet friend, Nan. Obviously, Nan does not rhyme with dilemma, but Gemma rhymes with dilemma. So if you needed any additional proof that this is the character that he's referencing, of course, he's talking about Mark and Gemma. Now, the tone, especially in the read version of this, the tone of this is very longing, very sad for the loss of Gemma. And I do think it's important. Maybe there's a clue outside the scope of conspiracy, just purely character motivations. There might be a clue here in the reading of Dr. Zhivago, which is a book about a romance that takes place during the Russian Revolution. And it's about someone who marries someone for practical reasons, but falls in love with somebody else. And this man who gets dragged around, almost Forrest Gump-like, through these constantly changing historical events that are way beyond their possible control. So not having control over their own livelihood, and torn between two women in these two romances. Now, is this just representing the duality of being severed, or is this represent that maybe Ricken had feelings for Gemma? I'm not 100% sure on any of that, but just interesting, just some food for thought. Just a little bit of a funny aside, although it's sad in the context of the story. Ricken, months later, shows up at Flip's house, Mark, of course. He apparently gave a throat singing album, or recorded one, to Nan as a birthday present, and wanted it back to make a copy of his own. Mark, as we've seen in the show itself, gets frustrated during this searching through her old things, can't find the tape, and loses his temper, as we've seen Mark lose his temper. This is actually happening in the basement, something that we've seen him, for whatever reasons, maybe representing his suppressed psychology, we've seen multiple times when he's in the basement of his house and loses his temper with somebody, whether it be his sister or Petey or Ragabi. This apparently was really surprising. He had never seen this flash of anger before. And this particular chapter ends with a funny beat that he had contemplated suing him for losing the cassette, which was a gift, but did not. But the cruel part of this is that Mark tells him that we used to listen to that tape just to make fun of you. And he has a very sweet way of looking at this. People process emotions differently, and he doesn't believe that Mark hated him in the moment, despite he acted hatefully, but also that even if people were laughing supposedly at him, that he was still bringing them pleasure, and that he didn't take it as a cruelty at all. And as you read the entirety of the book, maybe this says something about Ricken himself, who grew up, we discover, in an orphanage. He had an inappropriate fixation on his social worker, who he hung out with, went to see movies with. It does make you wonder when we see that Cobel grew up in this girls' school and that Ricken was part of this orphanage group. A lot of his work was labor, once again, tending different types of animals. If this was explicitly a Lumen organization or perhaps covertly a Lumen operation, and maybe this is where he picked up some of this philosophy. A couple of more funny biographical notes regarding Ricken. His parents apparently had a 9-month performance art exhibition, supposedly. Sounds like just homelessness, but apparently it was reviewed in the newspaper, and it was Ricken's birth. So it was from conception to birth, a 9-month art project called, I think, Smells Like Afterbirth Effers. And apparently they ended up in jail when they had another performance called Cheers Effers, where they apparently went to the Cheers bar in Boston and held everybody at gunpoint. A little too radical, if that wasn't a straight up robbery. On the surface of it, looks like just criminal activity. So he grew up alienated from his parents. He had this strange upbringing. He used to live in the city with his wife and now living closer to the Lumen facility. And he's written quite a few of these self-help type books. And now the content of the book, and explicitly, if this is not some kind of Lumen psyop, if this is just coincidence, you can imagine their fascination with his philosophy because it overlaps so much with this Lumen philosophy. First of all, he has a concept of a U-type. The U-type includes the coward, which correlates pretty heavily with dread, the warrior, which coincides pretty explicitly with malice. But then there is the dove and the vestal, which don't really correlate directly to woe or frolic, and the scribe. And these are interesting. The dove is someone who's always trying to be the peacekeeper. The vestal is the blank slate, the innocent that has no opinion. And he actually has quite an affinity for this character, saying like, you may very well feel like you are the outsider, but actually you are the purist. You are the vessel for receiving this information. And lastly, something that is not touched on at all in any of the Lumen philosophy, which is this concept of the scribe. And the scribe is the writer, the one who processes the information. He sees himself as the scribe, the one who writes the stories, which of course does not map at all into any of these philosophical points that we've seen in any of the Lumen material. One more interesting correlation to Lumen philosophy, he uses a lot of acrostics in his writing. And whenever he uses the word destiny, he makes it all uppercase. And in chapter 5, he writes this poem, an acrostic poem, Experience, by author Ricken Hale. Destiny. D is for dreaming, the start of it all. E is for energy, breaking down walls. S is for stewardship of home and of earth. T is for terror, which gives us more worth. I is for eyes, which observe us with love, until N, meaning newness, rains down from above. And why? That's a question we need not ponder, for destiny, friends, shall deliver us yonder. A lot of that is pretty dumb, but I want to bring it up because there's not only the 4 humors, there are also the 9 principles of Kier. And see if this overlaps pretty strongly with that destiny poem. I was blind till you gave me vision, vision being the first principle. I was languid till you gave me verve. I was simple till you gave me wit. I was peevish till you gave me cheer. I was vain till you gave me humility. I was cruel till you gave me benevolence. I was gawkish till you gave me nimbleness. I was false till you gave me probity. I was dim till you gave me wiles. I was me till you gave me you. So the very last line of this, I was me until you gave me you, makes me think about the you are. So a lot of overlapping explicitly in these segments of the book, these 8 chapters that are published, in correlating both back to these 9 principles or back to the 5 U types correlating back to the 4 humors in the Lumen philosophy. All this makes me wonder, how exactly does Ricken have these connections or understanding of the Lumen philosophy? What I honestly felt in season 1, this is purely satire on these self-help books. While I was actually downloading this particular ebook, I looked at the more popular books out there, and some of them are self-help books with such obvious and silly philosophies, like you need to focus on improving your own life and don't be so controlling in controlling your spouse or your children's lives. Try to work on things you can control and don't work so much, get caught up on things you can't control, with all these little acrostics and little notes to yourself. It seems so simple, but I guess these are very popular. And by the way, also very useful to people that even just have things that seem really obvious, just said aloud back to you. That's honestly why there's such an industry of self-help books for many decades now. I thought this was purely satire on this new agey self-help in counterpoint to the philosophy inside of Lumen, which is about giving up all to the greater good of the business rather than this new agey self-improvement. And I actually think the series is still mocking that, or at least exploring it. But it's almost undeniable at this point that there is something more going on here. Even as that satire continues to be present, there is definitely something between Lumen and Ricken in his past, perhaps. And it could be even something more extreme, like these are actual severed people. Maybe this is one of the personas, Ricken is, an innie, and maybe not even aware of the fact that he went through one of these procedures when he was much younger. And somehow, some of that Lumen knowledge has leaked out into his own writings. Anyway, more to be seen there. Probably not going to be discussed in any length here in season 2, but possibly something to look forward to in season 3. And hey, I wouldn't be surprised if the rest of Ricken's book is published, perhaps when season 3 of Severance comes out. Hopefully, not 3 years from now, but within a year and a half or so. Okay, so I hope you did enjoy some of that. Oh, I do want to mention that you should just read these books. There is a whole chapter on how many times he's had sex. It's absolutely hilarious. He has made love 786 times, and each was a unique adventure into the very mouth of personhood. He also has a whole chapter on religion and the limitations of there, and has a very negative take on Sister Act, which he sees as some kind of propaganda. He's taking Sister Act way too seriously. Do check it out. Very funny, but I did want to at least bring up some of those potential clues. Thanks again for listening. On the podcast in a few days, The White Lotus, episode 4. Look forward to our coverage of Dope Thief coming later in the month. 2 more episodes of Severance. And as usual, of course, always look forward to any feedback. Email us at needssomeintroduction@gmail.com or post comments on our YouTube videos. And of course, subscribe to the podcast, subscribe to YouTube, our YouTube channel, and I'll talk to you soon.